If you've ever wondered why a narcissist seems to lose all interest in you the moment you stop chasing them, here's the honest answer. It was never really about you to begin with. It was about what you gave them. Your attention, your emotional reactions, your willingness to explain yourself, defend yourself, and keep trying to make the relationship work were never just side effects of the connection. They were the very thing keeping the dynamic alive. Every text you sent asking for clarity, every attempt to prove your intentions, every emotional response to their criticism or mixed signals gave them something they depended on. Whether it was validation, control, admiration, or simply the reassurance that they could still influence your emotional state, your engagement became the fuel that powered the entire cycle. This is why so many people feel confused when the relationship suddenly seems to lose intensity after they stop reacting. They expect more arguments, more attempts to pull them back in, or at least some dramatic confrontation. Instead, the energy often fades. The reason is surprisingly simple. A performance only continues as long as there is an audience willing to watch it. When there is no applause, no outrage, no desperate attempt to change the ending, the script begins to fall apart. For someone who relies heavily on external validation or emotional control, relationships can become less about mutual connection and more about maintaining a reliable source of emotional supply. That supply can take many forms. It might be admiration, constant reassurance, attention, conflict, or even watching another person repeatedly chase after approval. As long as that supply continues, there is a reason to keep the cycle going. But once the fuel disappears, everything changes. The conversations no longer provide the emotional payoff they once did. Attempts to provoke a reaction become less rewarding. Manipulative patterns that once worked effortlessly suddenly produce silence instead of emotional intensity. Without the expected response, the familiar strategies lose much of their effectiveness. This is why many people notice that once they stop arguing, stop defending themselves, stop explaining every decision, or stop trying to convince the other person to understand them, the dynamic begins to collapse. It is not because silence is magical. It is because the emotional exchange that sustained the unhealthy pattern has been interrupted. For individuals with strong narcissistic traits, this interruption can feel deeply frustrating. If one source of validation or emotional control is no longer available, they may redirect their attention elsewhere. Rather than examining their own behavior or rebuilding the relationship through accountability, they may seek another person who is more responsive to the familiar cycle. A new audience is often easier than rewriting the script. That shift can be painful to witness because it may appear as though the relationship never mattered. In reality, it often reflects the way the relationship functioned. If someone valued the emotional supply more than genuine intimacy, they are likely to pursue whatever continues to provide that supply. This does not mean every person who leaves a relationship is narcissistic or simply looking for someone new. Healthy relationships end for many legitimate reasons, and people move on in different ways. But in relationships built around manipulation, validation seeking, and emotional control, the pattern is often remarkably consistent. When the emotional fuel disappears, the motivation to keep performing often disappears with it. The important realization is that your silence is not about punishing anyone. It is about stepping out of a cycle that required your constant emotional investment to survive. When you stop providing endless attention, reactions, and effort to be understood, you are no longer feeding a dynamic that depends on your exhaustion. And that is why the performance eventually loses its purpose. Without fuel, even the brightest fire cannot keep burning forever. The spotlight dims, the script loses its power, and the person who depended on your reactions often turns away, searching for another stage where the audience is still willing to play its part. Most people try to deal with a narcissist by arguing back, defending themselves, or trying to prove they're right. It feels natural. It feels necessary. But it's exactly the wrong move, because arguing gives them precisely what they're after: drama, attention, a reaction they can work with. What actually disarms a narcissist isn't a sharper comeback or a better argument. It's calm. It's indifference. It's you quietly becoming someone they can no longer get a rise out of. Before going further, it's worth being clear about the intent here. None of this is about revenge or trying to punish anyone. It's about protecting your own mind, your own energy, your own sense of peace. Narcissists behave like emotional vampires in a sense. They don't produce their own sense of self-worth, so they draw it from you through your fear, your anger, your sadness, even your love. As long as you keep reacting, you keep the connection alive, whether that connection feels good or terrible. Psychologists who study narcissism often point out that people high in narcissistic traits tend to view the people close to them less as independent individuals and more as extensions of themselves, sources of validation and control rather than equals. That's a hard thing to accept about someone you may have loved. But once you see it clearly, something shifts. The illusion depends entirely on your participation. The moment you stop playing along, stop reacting, stop chasing, stop explaining, their sense of control starts to crumble. So let's talk about what actually works. The first thing is learning to withhold your emotional reactions. To a narcissist, it doesn't much matter whether you love them or resent them. What matters is that you're still feeling something intensely enough to show it. Tears, pleading, arguing, over-explaining yourself, all of it reads as proof that you still care, and that's all they need. It helps to think of it the way you'd think about a child mid-tantrum. A child who gets attention for a meltdown learns that meltdowns work. A narcissist operates on the same logic, just with an adult's vocabulary and a toddler's emotional range. Every time you react, you're teaching them that the behavior pays off. Every time you don't, you're teaching them the opposite. Expect pushback at first. If you stop reacting, many narcissists will escalate, say crueler things, provoke harder, maybe even soften and act like they're changing, anything to get a response out of you. But if you can hold steady and offer nothing, no anger, no sorrow, no excitement, you'll usually watch the intensity fade. There's no point performing for an audience that's stopped watching. And to be clear, this isn't about faking indifference or gritting your teeth through it. It's about actually reaching the place where their words, their jabs, their little dramas simply don't land anymore. That's not a trick. That's real strength, and it takes time to build. The second thing is going no contact and doing it properly. A lot of people think they've gone no contact while still leaving several doors cracked open. Real no contact means no messages, direct or through mutual friends, no checking their social media, no driving past places they might be, no quietly asking around for updates. Every one of those small leaks keeps the connection breathing. Picture a burglar walking down a street checking houses. One has a locked gate, cameras, motion lights, a dog barking behind the fence. He keeps walking. The next house has an open window and no alarm. That's the one he tries. Narcissists operate the same way. They're drawn to easy access. If you make yourself hard to reach, most of the time they'll simply redirect their energy towards someone easier. That's why the no contact has to be total. Block the number, block the accounts, change your number if you have to, and ask mutual friends to stop passing along updates in either direction. The hardest part isn't blocking them. It's resisting the urge to check on them yourself. Every glance at their profile, every question you ask about their life, chips away at the boundary you're trying to build, and somehow they always seem to sense it. But once you go fully quiet, you become genuinely hard to reach, and a person who can't manipulate what they can't contact eventually stops trying, even if they test the waters now and then along the way. The third thing is to stop explaining or defending yourself. Narcissists are remarkably skilled at twisting your own words back at you and at accusing you of things you never did just to keep the conversation going. The more energy you spend explaining, the deeper you sink into a debate you were never going to win, because winning was never really the point for them. Keeping you talking was. When you defend yourself, you're implicitly agreeing that their judgment of you matters, that you need their approval to feel okay about who you are. Imagine instead what happens if you simply stop. They call you selfish, and you say, okay. They claim you never cared, and you answer, that's your opinion, nothing more. That flat, ungiving response takes the wind out of their sails, because their whole strategy depends on your need to be understood by them specifically. Once that need is gone, they've lost their leverage. This doesn't mean staying silent no matter the stakes. If your reputation or your job is genuinely on the line, defend yourself where it counts, professionally and factually. But in personal relationships, silence usually serves you better than argument. Every time you decline to explain yourself, you're quietly telling them that their opinion no longer has jurisdiction over your life. That message lands harder than any comeback could. The fourth thing is real indifference, not performed indifference. Pretending not to care rarely works because narcissists are often unsettlingly good at picking up on forced or fake energy. Genuine indifference is different. It means you've actually healed enough that you don't care who they're with, what they're doing, or what they're saying about you. They simply stop occupying space in your emotional life. Getting there usually requires some grieving first. Not grieving the person exactly, but grieving the version of them you believed in, the potential you saw, the connection you thought was real. Once you let yourself feel that loss, instead of avoiding it, something clears. You start to see them more accurately, not powerful or mysterious, but insecure and in their own way quite limited. Their cruelty tends to come from an emptiness they've never dealt with. Their need for control tends to come from fear. Once you can see that plainly, their behavior stops feeling personal and it stops having the same grip on you. It's worth noting that true indifference isn't the same as hatred. Hatred still keeps you emotionally tied to them. It's still a reaction, still fuel. Real indifference is quieter than that. It's neutrality. You stop trying to understand them, fix them, or hold out for them to change, and they gradually fade out of your emotional world altogether. That fading is where freedom actually starts. The fifth thing is redirecting your energy fully toward your own life. This is where the real healing tends to happen. You stop living in reaction to them. Stop posting things designed to be seen by them. Stop trying to prove you're doing fine. Stop hoping to run into them somewhere and show off how well you've moved on. You stop asking yourself what they'd think if you did this or that. Instead, you build something of your own, new projects, new people, work that actually interests you, habits that make you feel good in your own body and mind. Something genuinely changes when you do this consistently. Your energy shifts. You start to feel more solid, more at ease, less like you're constantly bracing for something. And this, more than almost anything else, tends to bother a narcissist because it dismantles the story they were relying on. The idea that you need them, that you're lost without them. When you're clearly building a good life without their involvement, whatever hold they had starts to loosen. You're too busy living to keep tracking their chaos. The sixth thing is letting go of the urge to expose them or fix them. This one is often the hardest because your sense of fairness screams that someone should be held accountable, that people deserve to know the truth. But every attempt to expose a narcissist tends to hand them more attention, and attention, even hostile attention, is still fuel to them. They generally don't care if people think badly of them. They care that people are still talking about them at all. There's also a harder truth here. Narcissists are often charming to outsiders and have frequently already shaped the narrative in their own favor before you ever say a word. When you try to set the record straight, it can end up looking like proof of the very story they've already told, that you're bitter, unstable, obsessed. It's an unfair dynamic, but a common one, and going in expecting a fair hearing from people who weren't there usually leads to more pain. The same logic applies to trying to change them. You cannot fix someone who doesn't believe there's anything wrong with them. Sending them articles, urging them toward therapy, explaining their own patterns back to them, none of that tends to land the way you hope, and all of it keeps you emotionally invested in an outcome you don't actually control. Their growth was never your job. Letting go of that responsibility is how you get your energy back, and it's how you shift from being a supporting character in their story to being the main character in your own. In the long run, living well tends to say more than any argument ever could, not because it gets back at them, but because it's genuinely good for you. The seventh and final piece is becoming someone who simply isn't available as a source of supply anymore, not just physically distant, but emotionally out of reach. This is the deepest level of detachment, the point where their messages don't rattle you, their insults don't land, and even their praise doesn't pull you back in. You're steady either way. You give them nothing to work with, no anger, no affection, no explanation, no bait, not cold out of spite, but calm because you've genuinely settled somewhere solid inside yourself. Reaching that point does more than end one relationship. It tends to change who you attract going forward. People who thrive on control and chaos can usually sense when someone has nothing left to give them, and they lose interest fast. Meanwhile, people capable of real reciprocity tend to be drawn toward that same steadiness. This isn't about performing strength, it's about becoming someone who has actually done the internal work, someone who understands that their own peace is worth more than the approval of someone who was never going to give it freely anyway. Put simply, stop reacting. Go no contact and mean it. Stop explaining yourself to someone who was never listening in good faith. Build real indifference instead of faking it. Pour your energy into your own life instead of monitoring theirs. let go of the need to expose or fix them, and finally become someone who no longer has anything left to offer as supply. None of this is about punishing anyone. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you spent trying to be understood by someone who was never going to understand you the way you deserved. The strange thing about healing from this kind of relationship is how much it reveals in hindsight. You start to notice how much time you spent trying to earn affection from someone who simply didn't have much genuine affection to offer. You remember all the times you tried to explain yourself, hoping this time they'd finally get it, only to be met with more confusion or blame. Looking back, you start to see that the constant arguments, the whiplash between coldness and sudden warmth, none of it was a reflection of anything you did wrong. It was simply how the dynamic was built, a pattern designed, whether consciously or not, to keep you off balance and questioning your own judgment. Stepping outside that pattern tends to feel strange at first, almost unfamiliar. The quiet that once felt uncomfortable slowly starts to feel like relief. In the beginning, silence can feel like a loss. You might catch yourself missing the intensity, even the chaos, simply because your nervous system had adjusted to operating at that pitch. What you're missing usually isn't the person themselves so much as the adrenaline of the up and down. That's a recognized pattern sometimes called trauma bonding. Your brain learns to associate a person with both comfort and threat, which paradoxically makes the connection feel stronger, not weaker. Given time and distance, though, that fog does lift. Sleep gets easier. Small things start to feel enjoyable again. You start to feel safe in ordinary, quiet moments, and that safety is one of the clearest signs that you're actually healing. It's worth remembering, too, that someone who behaves this way rarely expects the people they've hurt to actually recover and move forward. The expectation, often, is that you'll stay stuck replaying the story, waiting for an apology or an explanation that finally makes sense of everything. But real closure doesn't usually come from them. It comes from deciding you don't need it, that you don't need them to admit fault, that you don't need to hear the right words from someone whose words were rarely sincere to begin with. Once that clicks, you stop waiting on someone else to hand you permission to move on. None of this happens overnight. It's less like flipping a switch and more like walking slowly out of a dark room. The light is uncomfortable at first, and then gradually you start noticing color again. Small pleasures return. Your own laughter, a quiet morning with nobody to answer to, the comfort of simply being alone with your thoughts without dread attached to it. You start to remember who you were before the self-doubt crept in, and as that happens, you'll likely notice your relationships shifting too. People who value calm and honesty tend to feel comfortable around you, while people who thrive on chaos tend to drift away, uneasy in the presence of someone who's no longer available to fuel it. That shift, chaos starting to feel foreign and peace starting to feel normal, is one of the clearest markers of real growth. It's a reminder that healthy love isn't supposed to hurt. It's supposed to feel steady, consistent, safe. A dynamic built on control and unpredictability simply can't survive in that kind of environment, which is part of why someone like this tends to lose interest once you stop supplying the confusion they relied on. They'll likely look elsewhere, towards someone still willing to react, still willing to chase. Let that be their path, not yours. You were never responsible for filling whatever was missing in them, and you were never meant to be their therapist, their fixer, or their emotional safety net. What you can take from an experience like this is real, even if it came at a cost. A sharper sense of your own boundaries, a better ear for your own intuition, and a clearer understanding of what your peace is actually worth. The pain was real, but so is what comes after it. The version of you that no longer tolerates disrespect, that has learned the value of silence, that gives itself the care it once searched for elsewhere. That's not a small shift, that's a rebuilding. There will still be moments, even well into healing, where something catches you off guard, a song, a memory, an old message resurfacing. When that happens, the goal isn't to never feel anything. It's to notice the feeling, let it pass through, and recognize that it no longer has the power to pull you backward. Every time you choose stillness over reaction, you're reinforcing something important. Every time you walk away, instead of trying to prove your worth to someone who was never going to see it, you're reinforcing it again. That's not a dramatic victory. It's a quiet one, the kind that happens privately with no audience, which is exactly why it's real. In time, you'll likely stop wondering whether they think about you and stop trying to make logical sense of behavior that was never rooted in logic to begin with. People who operate this way tend to be driven less by malice and more by fear, fear of being ordinary, fear of being overlooked, fear of being seen clearly. Confidence in that context often functions less like a genuine trait and more like a mask over something much less certain underneath. Understanding that doesn't excuse the harm, but it can help loosen its grip on you. What comes after all of this isn't really about them at all anymore. It's about the person you become in the process. Someone who trusts their own instincts again, who no longer over-explains their boundaries, who doesn't shrink to keep the peace with people who never valued it in the first place. That shift, more than any argument won or any exposure achieved, is what actually marks the end of the story. Not the moment you prove them wrong, but the moment their name stops meaning anything to your nervous system at all. If you're still in the middle of this, still tangled in the confusion, still hurting, that's okay. This kind of healing takes real time and it rarely moves in a straight line. But every day you hold the boundary, every day you choose calm over the pull of old chaos, you're moving closer to a version of your life that has nothing to do with them. Progress here isn't measured by how quickly you stop thinking about what happened. It's measured by how little power those thoughts hold over you when they do show up. And slowly, almost without noticing, you'll find that you've built a life steadier, calmer, more honestly yours than the one you were fighting so hard to hold on to.